The scorching desert heat permeated the air, making the atmosphere in Jerusalem almost suffocating. The city, a crossroads of cultures, religions, and political power, buzzed with the constant hum of voices and the movement of people. The temple, majestic and imposing, was the epicenter of religious and cultural life. There, under the shadow of its massive columns, the religious leaders, known as scribes and Pharisees, debated the complexities of the law of Moses. In this era, the law was the moral compass guiding the Jewish people, but also a tool in the hands of those who interpreted it with inflexible rigor. One of the areas where this severity was most evident was in the punishment of sexual crimes, especially adultery. The law was clear: those caught in adultery should be stoned to death. Marital infidelity was seen not just as a personal betrayal, but as an attack on the moral fabric of society. However, while the law demanded justice, there was another kind of justice, more compassionate and complex, emerging in the words and actions of a man named Jesus. He was not an ordinary rabbi. His words often challenged traditions and religious leaders, who saw in his parables a threat to their power and control. To the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus was a dangerous enigma, someone who needed to be discredited and, if possible, eliminated. Amid this backdrop of religious and social tension, a woman was caught in the act of adultery. Humiliated and dragged through the streets of Jerusalem, she was placed before Jesus in the temple, where the crowd gathered in anticipation. It was a test for Jesus, a trap carefully planned by the Pharisees. If he upheld the law of Moses and condemned the woman, he would lose his reputation for mercy. If he failed to condemn her, he could be accused of disrespecting the law. This was the context in which the story unfolded, a scene of harsh judgments, rigid justice, and a society divided between strict adherence to the law and the new message of love and forgiveness that Jesus preached. The stage was set for a confrontation that would profoundly mark the course of human history. The morning sun already illuminated the steps of the temple, where Jesus sat to teach. His presence drew crowds, a mix of curious onlookers, devoted followers, and watchful critics. The words of Jesus, laden with wisdom and authority, resonated deeply in the hearts of those who listened. However, on that day, the murmur of expectation was interrupted by a growing commotion among the people. Through the crowd, the Pharisees and scribes pushed their way forward, shoving a woman ahead of them. She was barefoot, her hair disheveled, and her face marked by shame. Her eyes avoided the gaze of those around her, fixed instead on the ground as she was thrust into the center of attention. The murmurs grew louder, and people stepped back, making way for the group. "Teacher," one of the Pharisees began, his voice filled with authority but also cunning, "this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The Pharisees stared at him, waiting, ready to use any answer against him. If Jesus said to uphold the law and stone her, he would compromise his reputation for mercy. If he told them to spare her, he could be accused of disregarding the law of Moses, a blasphemy that could cost him his life. The crowd watched in silence. People wondered how Jesus, who seemed to have answers for every question, would respond to this dilemma. The woman trembled, knowing that her life was in the hands of this man whose words had transformed so many, but who now might determine her fate. But Jesus, instead of answering immediately, did something unexpected. He stooped down and began to write on the ground with his finger. The Pharisees looked at each other, confused. The crowd murmured, trying to understand the meaning of this gesture. What was he doing? Why wasn't he responding? What was he writing? As his hand moved slowly across the dusty ground, the silence grew heavier. The words he traced were invisible to most, but the impact of the gesture was undeniable. Rather than rush to judgment or answer, Jesus was creating a moment of pause, a space for reflection, both for the accusers and the onlookers. Time seemed to slow down, and the air was thick with tension. Everyone awaited Jesus' next word, but instead, all they had was the soft sound of his finger drawing in the dust. It was as if time itself had stopped to contemplate the depth of that moment, a moment that would transcend generations and continue to inspire reflections on justice, mercy, and the true nature of forgiveness. The silence that followed Jesus' gesture was profound, almost palpable. The crowd, which had been murmuring and discussing animatedly, now stood in a state of attentive anticipation. Every person present in the temple felt the weight of that moment, but none fully understood what was happening. Why did Jesus, who so often spoke with clarity and conviction, now remain silent, writing in the dust? The Pharisees, who had expected a verbal confrontation, were perplexed. What did this act mean? Was it an evasion, a tactic to buy time, or was there a deeper meaning in what he was doing? The woman, still standing at the center of the scene, shrank back, awaiting the judgment that seemed imminent but had somehow been suspended. Jesus, instead of reacting to the Pharisees' provocation, seemed absorbed in deep contemplation, as if he were conversing with something or someone beyond what the others could see. The act of writing in the dust, as simple as it was, altered the dynamics of the moment. The silence was not just an absence of sound, it was an invitation to introspection, to reflection. The Pharisees, seeing that Jesus had not yet responded, began to press him again. "And what do you say, teacher? The law is clear on what should be done with a woman like this." Their impatience and desire to trap Jesus were evident in their voices. They wanted to force him to commit, to fall into their snare. But Jesus continued writing. Every stroke in the dust seemed to carry a hidden meaning, an enigma that defied immediate comprehension. Perhaps he was writing the sins of those present, or maybe he was simply drawing lines with no apparent meaning. No one knew, and this uncertainty created even greater tension. Finally, Jesus looked up, his eyes meeting those of the Pharisees. The calmness in his expression contrasted with the agitation around him. He then uttered the words that would echo through eternity. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." Those simple words struck the hearts of those present with devastating force. It was not just a response, it was a moral challenge that exposed the hypocrisy of the accusers. The silence before now took on a new meaning. Jesus was not avoiding the question. He was guiding everyone there to a deeper understanding of justice, a justice that was not based merely on the letter of the law but on the truth of the human heart. The Pharisees, who had prepared for an easy victory, found themselves confronted by their own consciences. And one by one, they began to leave, starting with the oldest, whose lives were marked by years of mistakes and regrets. The crowd, which had seemed eager for blood before, now dispersed in silence, left with a profound lesson on the complexity of judgment and the necessity of mercy. Jesus, for his part, resumed writing in the dust, his task still unfinished. After the Pharisees departed, a strange calm lingered in the air. The woman, still standing before Jesus, watched as people slowly dispersed. Her eyes, once filled with fear and shame, were now filled with confusion as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The gesture of Jesus, so simple yet enigmatic, left everyone with a lingering question. What did he write in the dust? Over the centuries, this act has become the subject of countless speculations and debates. Numerous theories have been proposed by scholars, theologians, and religious thinkers, each trying to unravel the mystery behind the words traced in the dust. Although the biblical text does not reveal the exact content, human imagination has sought to fill this gap with interpretations that reflect the depth of the event. One of the most popular theories suggests that Jesus wrote the sins of the accusers, beginning with the oldest. This interpretation is based on the reaction of those who, upon seeing what Jesus wrote, were the first to leave the scene, acknowledging their own guilt and hypocrisy. The idea that each Pharisee saw their sins exposed in the dust aligns with Jesus' teaching about introspection and just judgment. Another interpretation suggests that Jesus was writing passages from the law of Moses, perhaps reminding the Pharisees that the law itself demands impartial and merciful judgment. Some scholars believe he may have written Deuteronomy 17 verse 7, which says, "The hands of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people." This would have reminded the accusers that to stone the woman, they themselves must be without fault. There are also those who propose that Jesus was writing something more symbolic, perhaps a message directed at the human condition in general. By writing in the dust, a material that can easily be erased, Jesus may have symbolized the fleeting nature of sin and the possibility of redemption. Just as the words in the dust can be erased by the wind, sins can be forgiven by divine grace. Some modern interpretations even suggest that the act of writing in the dust was a strategy to divert the accuser's attention, creating a deliberate pause that led them to reflect on their own actions before acting rashly. In this sense, Jesus' gesture was not just about what he wrote but about the psychological impact of his action. However, all these theories, intriguing as they may be, cannot fully capture the mystery and depth of this act. Perhaps the true reason Jesus wrote in the dust lies in the multidimensional nature of his gesture. Each interpretation reveals an aspect of Jesus' wisdom and character, but none can claim to be the definitive answer. Thus, the mystery remains. And perhaps it is this mystery that continues to attract generations of believers and scholars, challenging them to reflect on justice, forgiveness, and the infinite compassion that Jesus demonstrated that day in the temple. The contrast between divine justice and human justice was powerfully illustrated in the episode of the adulterous woman. Confronted by the Pharisees and scribes, who wielded the law of Moses like a weapon to condemn, Jesus revealed the profound difference between earthly judgment and divine judgment. The Pharisees believed they were acting in accordance with justice. To them, the strict application of the law was the ultimate expression of God's justice. The woman, caught in the very act of adultery, had violated one of the most sacred rules, and the prescribed punishment was clear: death by stoning. In the minds of the accusers, there was no room for mercy or consideration of circumstances. The law was immutable and had to be carried out without question. But Jesus, by writing in the dust and then challenging them with the words, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her," revealed a much deeper and more complex form of justice. He did not deny the law of Moses but placed it in perspective, reminding the accusers that divine justice is not merely about the rigid application of the law but also about understanding, compassion, and recognizing human imperfection. While the Pharisees saw the law as an end in itself, Jesus saw it as a means to achieve a higher good: the reconciliation of humanity with God. The justice of God, as exemplified by Jesus, cannot be separated from mercy. Where humans see a reason to punish, God sees an opportunity to forgive. Where humans see transgression, God sees the potential for redemption. This episode at the temple demonstrated that divine justice does not ignore sin, but it also does not stop at punishing it. Instead, it seeks to restore the sinner, giving them a new chance, an opportunity to change. Jesus' gesture of writing in the dust, followed by his challenging words, exposed the hypocrisy of the accusers and invited them to reflect on their own lives. He showed them that true justice is not in pointing fingers at others but in looking within oneself and acknowledging the need for forgiveness. Human justice, as exemplified by the Pharisees, is often based on quick and punitive judgments. It is a justice that divides, that condemns, that creates separations between us and them. Divine justice, on the other hand, as revealed by Jesus, seeks to unite, heal, and restore. It recognizes human fallibility and offers a path to redemption. Thus, the episode of the adulterous woman serves as a powerful reminder that, while human justice may be flawed and limited, divine justice is perfect in its combination of truth and love. Jesus, when confronting the Pharisees that day, not only saved a life but also revealed an eternal truth. God's justice is inseparable from his mercy, and it is this justice we should seek in our own lives. As the words of Jesus echoed through the temple, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her," a new silence descended, this time heavier and more introspective. The Pharisees, who moments before were eager to condemn the woman, felt the impact of those words on their hearts and minds. The challenge Jesus presented was not merely rhetorical. It was a call for each of them to reflect on their own lives. The eldest of the Pharisees, a man known for his rigid application of the law, was the first to feel the weight of that reflection. He had dedicated his life to the study of the Scriptures, applying the laws with a firm hand. But at that moment, he was confronted by his own conscience. Jesus' words forced him to look within, to consider his own failings and sins, many of which he had justified or ignored over the years. His hand, which held a stone ready to be thrown, began to tremble. One by one, the other Pharisees felt the same. The now silent crowd watched as each accuser, without saying a word, dropped their stones and walked away. They had come with a clear intention: to trap Jesus or, at the very least, reaffirm their own power by applying the law of Moses. But now, they were leaving defeated, not by Jesus, but by their own consciences. The woman, still standing in the center of the scene, looked around, incredulous. What had seemed moments earlier to be an implacable judgment and a certain death sentence had suddenly dissolved before her eyes. She had expected the worst, but now, for reasons she could barely comprehend, she was free. This moment of forced reflection was not only a blow to the pride of the Pharisees, it was a powerful lesson about the nature of judgment and hypocrisy. Jesus, by writing in the dust and issuing the challenge, exposed the flaws in their hearts. They were ready to condemn without considering that they too were under God's gaze, subject to the same judgment they were imposing on the woman. For the Pharisees, who prided themselves on their strict adherence to the law, it was a moment of humiliation. They realized that before God, all are sinners and that none of them had the right to judge others so harshly. The law they wielded as a weapon to condemn had been turned into a mirror reflecting their own failings. This episode marked a turning point in Jesus' relationship with the religious leaders. They understood that he was not just a teacher or a rabbi. He possessed an authority that transcended human understanding, an authority that could expose the depths of the human heart with just a few words. As the Pharisees walked away, the impact of that moment took root in their souls. What would they do with this newfound self-awareness? Would they return to their previous lives, trying to forget what had happened, or would they change their lives in light of this new revelation? That was the true power of Jesus' gesture, not only saving the woman from condemnation, but also offering a chance for redemption to the accusers themselves. With the departure of the Pharisees, the temple, which had been the scene of a tense and expectant confrontation, was now enveloped in a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of judgment, but the silence of redemption, the peace that comes after a storm. The woman, who moments before had been on the brink of death, was now alone before Jesus. Her eyes, once filled with fear and despair, now met the gaze of Jesus, who looked at her with deep compassion. He stood up, leaving behind the dust where he had written something that no one else knew, and looked at the woman. The remaining crowd watched, curious, trying to understand what would happen next. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something that challenged their notions of justice and condemnation. Jesus then spoke, his words filled with a gentleness and authority that only he possessed. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" The question, so simple yet powerful, resonated in the woman's heart. She looked around, realizing that indeed, all those who had sought her death had left. With a voice still trembling, she replied, "No one, Lord." Her response, almost incredulous, reflected the transformation of the moment. She had stood on the brink of certain death, but now, for reasons she could scarcely comprehend, she was free. Then Jesus spoke the words that would change her life forever. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." With this, he absolved her, not only from a physical sentence but from a spiritual condemnation. The forgiveness that Jesus granted to this woman was deeper than mere absolution from punishment. It was a call to renewal, to a changed life. Jesus, by forgiving her, did not ignore her sin. He acknowledged the wrongdoing but also offered a new chance. The power of forgiveness, as Jesus demonstrated, is not just the removal of guilt but the offering of a new life, a new opportunity to do better. This forgiveness was not cheap. It came with the challenge to sin no more, to live a transformed life. This act of forgiveness also reverberated among those present, leaving many reflecting on the nature of forgiveness and justice. Jesus had shown that true power does not lie in condemning but in restoring, in giving a new chance. Forgiveness, as he demonstrated, is one of the most powerful gestures a human being can receive or offer. It changes lives, heals hearts, and transforms destinies. After the encounter in the temple, the scene of Jesus writing in the sand continued to resonate in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed the event. Although the exact content of what Jesus wrote was never revealed, the act itself carried profound spiritual significance, extending beyond the visible words and actions. The sand, a transient and fragile element, became the medium through which Jesus communicated an eternal and spiritual truth. Sand, unlike stone or parchment, does not preserve marks for long. Anything written on it can be erased with a simple breath of wind or a passing footstep. This physical fact serves as a powerful metaphor for the nature of sin and forgiveness. By writing in the sand, Jesus may have symbolized the impermanence of sin when confronted with divine forgiveness. Just as marks in the sand can be erased, sins too can be forgiven and forgotten by God's grace. The act of writing in the sand can also be seen as a symbol of Jesus' humility. He did not inscribe his words on stone, like the tablets of the Ten Commandments, but on something temporary and simple. This may reflect the accessible and merciful nature of his ministry. Jesus did not come to condemn but to offer grace and redemption, and the sand, being such a common and available material, reinforces the idea that God's forgiveness and love are equally accessible to everyone. Another spiritual aspect of Jesus' gesture lies in his deliberate choice of silence while writing. Instead of immediately confronting his accusers with words, he created a moment of introspection and reflection for both the Pharisees and the crowd. Jesus' silence was more eloquent than any speech could be. He offered everyone present the opportunity to reflect on their own lives, their own sins, and their need for mercy. There is also the possibility that Jesus' gesture of writing in the sand was a way of showing that, in the presence of God, even the most visible sins can be erased. Sand, unlike stone, does not keep a permanent record. This suggests that when God forgives, he not only cancels the debt but also removes the stain, allowing the person to start anew without the burden of the past. Jesus' act may have been a tangible demonstration that the kingdom of God is not based on a permanent record of human errors but on the possibility of redemption and renewal. Every mark he made in the sand was a living illustration of the temporary nature of sin when faced with divine forgiveness. Finally, Jesus' gesture invites each of us to reflect on how we deal with sin, both our own and that of others. Instead of carving faults in stone, Jesus invites us to see them as something that can be erased, that can be redeemed. He calls us to offer others the same forgiveness and grace that he so freely offers to us. The spiritual significance of writing in the sand is, therefore, an invitation to humility, reflection, and compassion. It reminds us that, in God, there are no sins that cannot be erased and no lives that cannot be restored. The gesture of Jesus writing in the sand, though brief and enigmatic, left an indelible mark on the history of Christianity and Christian theology. Over the centuries, this episode has been interpreted, retold, and reflected upon in sermons, theological writings, and art, each time reaffirming its spiritual power and its influence on our understanding of justice, forgiveness, and compassion. From the early days of the Church fathers and theologians have sought to understand the profound meaning of this act. The silence of Jesus, combined with his deliberate action of writing in the sand, became a symbol of divine wisdom that goes beyond human words. The way Jesus turned the situation around, from an imminent judgment to a deep reflection on sin and forgiveness, became an example of how divine justice transcends human justice. In the Middle Ages, mystics and medieval theologians delved into this episode, seeing in it a demonstration of the power of mercy over rigid law. For them, Jesus' writing in the sand was an illustration of the new covenant, where love and compassion surpass the inflexible demands of the old law. This gesture became an icon of what it means to be Christian, to forgive and to be forgiven, reflecting God's infinite patience and grace. In visual arts, the episode of the adulterous woman and Jesus writing in the sand has been depicted in paintings, sculptures, and stained glass, each work offering a unique interpretation of the moment. Artists like Rembrandt, Tintoretto, and many others captured the dramatic tension and serenity of Jesus at the center of the conflict, emphasizing the contrast between the hardness of the accuser's hearts and the softness of Jesus' gesture. These artistic representations served to perpetuate the story and keep the discussion about the meaning of his actions alive. Furthermore, this episode has profoundly influenced literature and poetry. Poets and writers over the centuries have been inspired by the image of Jesus writing in the sand, using it as a metaphor for the transience of life, the fragility of human judgment, and the eternity of divine love. The idea that sins can be written in the sand, only to be erased by the breath of forgiveness, has become a powerful theme in many spiritual and devotional texts. Contemporary theology also continues to draw inspiration from this episode. In an era where social justice and reconciliation are at the forefront, Jesus' gesture is often cited as an example of how we should approach sin and wrongdoing in society. Rather than condemn, we are called to create spaces for reflection, self-criticism, and the opportunity for change. The lasting impact of this episode extends to the fields of law and ethics as well. Jurists and moral philosophers often reflect on the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, a discussion that traces directly back to the way Jesus handled the situation with the. As we conclude our journey through this deeply significant episode in the life of Jesus, we are confronted with the question that has challenged scholars, theologians, and believers for centuries. What is the true reason Jesus wrote in the sand? Throughout the previous chapters, we have explored various possibilities, from a strategy to disarm the accusers, to silent introspection, to the spiritual symbolism of redemption and forgiveness. However, the true reason may not lie in a single explanation, but rather in the rich, multifaceted meanings that this simple gesture can contain. The act of writing in the sand can be seen as a symbol of the core message of Jesus. In that moment, he was not merely addressing a specific situation, but was revealing something fundamental about the nature of God and God's relationship with humanity. Through this act, Jesus demonstrated that divine justice is always tempered with mercy, that forgiveness is offered to all, regardless of how gravely they have failed, and that no one, except God, has the absolute right to judge others. The gesture of writing in the sand reminds us that human sins, no matter how burdensome, are not etched in stone. They are not permanent. Just as words written in the sand can be erased, so too can sins be forgiven and forgotten through divine grace. This underscores the central message of the gospel: the possibility of redemption, the constant offer of a second chance, and God's unconditional love for each of us. Moreover, by choosing silence and writing in the sand instead of offering an immediate verbal response, Jesus showed the power of reflection. He gave the accusers, the woman, and the crowd a moment to reconsider their actions and their lives. He teaches us that often the greatest power lies not in loud words, but in silent actions that allow for introspection and self-awareness. This episode also highlights how Jesus overturns expectations. He does not fit into the molds of leadership that the world knows. He does not impose himself with force or violence, but with compassion and wisdom. By writing in the sand, he reminded everyone present, and all of us, that God's way is different from the world's way. It is a way of humility, love, and forgiveness. Finally, the true reason Jesus wrote in the sand can be seen as a call to all of us. We are called to put down our stones of judgment, to recognize our own sins, and to offer others the same mercy we wish to receive. By following Jesus' example, we can transform our lives and the lives of those around us, replacing condemnation with compassion and judgment with grace. Therefore, the act of writing in the sand is not just an isolated gesture, but a continual invitation to live according to the principles of divine love and restorative justice. In that simple action, Jesus encapsulated the heart of the gospel. The promise that, in God, there is always hope, always forgiveness, and always a new opportunity to begin again. With this reflection, we conclude our exploration of the mystery and depth of this episode. The true reason Jesus wrote in the sand may never be fully known, but perhaps that is what makes the gesture so powerful. It continues to challenge, inspire, and invite us to delve deeper into the essence of Christ's message.